Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friend. Welcome to another episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Joe Tatta. As always, it's an honor and a pleasure to be spending this time with you. Today, we have a very special and distinguished guest joining us to discuss the topic of emotion and how emotion relates to chronic pain. If you follow this podcast or are up to date on the latest pain science, you know that the definition of pain is that it's both a physical as well as an emotional experience. Joining us today is Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Lisa is among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world for her revolutionary research in psychology as well as neuroscience. She is a university distinguished professor of psychology at Northeastern University with appointments at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. She is also the chief science officer for the Center of Law, Brain, and Behavior at Harvard University. In addition to the book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain and How Emotions Are Made, Dr. Barrett has published over 240 peer-reviewed scientific papers appearing in Science, Neuroscience, and other top journals in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, as well as 6 academic volumes published by Guilford Press. She has also given a popular TED Talk, which has over 6 million views on the topic of how emotions are made. Dr. Barrett has also received a National Institutes of Health Director Pioneer Award for her revolutionary research on emotions in the brain. On today's episode, you'll learn about some of the essential and new science behind how our brain perceives our experience and how that relates to how emotions are made. We'll also discuss the neuroscience behind interoception and how it relates to the creation and perception of emotions, as well as how we can take these lessons and use them to cultivate pro-social values and improve global healthcare. Okay, I'm excited to share this week's guest with you. Lisa was extremely generous with her time today. So this is a little bit longer episode than normal, but I think you'll find lots of important tidbits and enjoy every moment of this interview. Okay, without further ado, let's begin and let's meet Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Hi there, Lisa. Welcome to the podcast. It's a great honor to have you here this week.
Thanks so much, Joe, for having me on your podcast. It's good to be with you.
I've been interested in your work. I followed a little bit of your work specifically on interoception in the literature. And then, of course, your 2 books, which we'll talk about today, and we're going to link to them in the podcast, How Emotions Are Made and 7.5 Lessons. We'll talk both about those. I think probably, a good place to start is just for us to just approach the brain first in a way that's easy for people. So when most people think of the brain, they think of it as this vital organ that controls our body and maybe is in charge of thinking and feeling, so to speak. So as a neuroscientist, I think it's a good place to start and ask you, how do you view the brain? What's your view of the brain? And how does it differ from what I just said?
I don't know that it differs that much from what you just said. I think most people, your audience may be very aware of the fact that the brain is controlling the body. I think most people don't realize that, and actually a lot of scientists don't think that way. And I could give you many examples, which I find really amusing. But I think most people, the average person, thinks about their brain as important for thinking, for feeling, for seeing, like all the things that, we think make us special as creatures on this earth. And the things that our brain does very silently when everything's working properly, like controlling the systems of our body, that comes as a surprise to people, I think. And from an evolutionary standpoint, and also from an anatomical standpoint, this is your brain's most important job, is controlling the systems of your body to keep you alive and well. And the way that your brain does this, and the fact that your brain does this in the service of thinking and feeling and seeing, I think is it's a hard insight to grasp, because we don't experience our lives that way. We don't experience every hug that we get and every insult that we bear as having anything to do with the way that the brain is controlling the systems of the body. But in fact, that is your brain's most important job. And everything you think and feel and see is in the service, more or less, energetically of that task.
It's a good introduction. And you mentioned evolution. So I want to bring a little bit of evolution to the conversation because a lot of the research around pain actually pulls from evolution and draws from how our brain evolved and what its critical task is. So with those kind of real critical tasks, looking at the brain, what would you say the brain's critical tasks are with regard to us as functioning humans?
Well, the brain's critical task from an evolutionary standpoint is to keep you alive and well long enough to pass your genes on to the next generation and raise that generation to the point that its reproductive age. I mean, that's how evolutionary biologists would talk about it. I think pain is an interesting phenomenon to approach in a comparative way because other animals have similar nociceptive. I'm assuming this is an audience that understands these distinctions.
Yeah,
but
we understand nociception. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that there are some similarities in nociceptive pathways, but the experience of pain and pain-related behavior is somewhat different in humans, that it has this. Barb Finley, the evolutionary neuroscientist, has written quite a bit about this in ways I find really compelling. She writes about pain as having a kind of a social signaling function, communication function for requesting support. Because we are social animals and we regulate each other's nervous systems, and the mere presence of another person can actually make a nociceptive stimulus more or less painful to you. You will experience more or less pain when someone is present, depending on who that person is and what their intention is towards you. So my main research interest is not pain, but I do find pain to be compelling. I wrote about it in How Emotions Are Made because it is constructed, the experience is constructed in much the same way that all experiences are constructed, but in particular the way emotions are constructed, that your brain is always regulating your body is always sending sense data back to your brain. This is continuous throughout your whole life. And your brain's job is to make sense of that sense data, to figure out what it means in order to know what to do about it, to be able to make decisions about what to do about it. And that's where things get really complicated and also really interesting if you're a scientist. So.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you look at the International Association for the Study of Pain's definition of pain,
I know
it's that it's both a physical as well as an emotional experience, which is why I, of course, wanted to have you on to talk about emotions. And you touched on it just briefly there. From your theories and perspectives and constructs that you've helped build out with regard to emotion, is that emotion is a perception, and that perception happens kind of ahead of time, even before it comes to our consciousness.
Yeah, so this is one of the really fascinating things. There are so many things that are fascinating about how brains work. And I was just telling my husband this morning, we were talking about prediction in particular, and I was saying, if I wasn't a neuroscientist and I didn't see the evidence with my own eyes, I'm really not sure I'd believe it, actually, because it sounds so preposterous. But yes, the way to think about it is that, here's an example, I think, which I think maybe illustrates it nicely. I use this in 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. When we when we're thirsty and we drink a glass of water or whatever, a glass of some beverage, some cool, refreshing beverage, we drink the whole thing, we're not thirsty anymore. But it takes 20 minutes for the water the liquid that you've imbibed to be to reach your bloodstream and change the osmolarity of your bloodstream to tell your brain that there's more hydration there. So 20 minutes earlier than the biological signal is there, you stop feeling thirsty. Why is that? And the answer is the same answer that I would give if you asked me, what is so interesting about baseball? Like why, how does a pitcher how does a batter swing a bat at a ball that he can't see, where it's going to be, but he's swinging, where it's going to be in a moment from now. And the answer in both cases is your brain's predicting. For your whole life, you've had many, many, many occasions where you've drunk, a liquid, and then at some point later you stop feeling thirsty. And so your brain basically is preparing your experience before the sense data actually arrive. Now, in the case of drinking water, it's 20 minutes. That's a long time. But in the case of most things, it's very, very quick. So for example, there's an example that I use when I'm demonstrating how the brain predicts. And I get people to imagine an apple. And I would say in their mind's eye, and I would say, I don't know, 70 or 80% of the time people would say, I'm salivating. And I'm like, yeah, you're salivating because I just got you to predict that you were going to eat an apple. You don't really believe that you're going to eat an apple, but for your brain to even understand what an apple is, it has to engage in the same neural pattern. And part of that pattern is preparing you to digest it. That's why you salivate in advance of eating a food. And in fact, Ivan Pavlov won a Nobel Prize for this at the turn of the century. He didn't understand that's what, his explanation for this phenomenon was completely wrong. And it was wrong for about 100 years, actually. But in fact, that's what's happening. Your brain is a prediction organ. It's predicting on the basis of how things are right now. If we were to stop time, your brain has some representation of what's going on inside your body and what's going on outside in the world. And your brain is predicting on the basis of past experience what is going to happen next. And the prediction is your brain changing the firing of its own neurons to prepare to receive the sense data and to act on it. So your brain starts to prepare your experience and your actions before it makes itself aware of that preparation. And in fact, if that's not, crazy enough, actually the prediction begins with motor responses and ends with sensory predictions. So based on how things are right now, your brain will change the internal motor pattern, prepare to change your internal motor patterning. So that's patterning, that's your heart rate, your, expanding your lungs and so on. It will prepare your motor response, because that takes actually, not a couple of minutes, but like some minutes to, some number of milliseconds to actually get done. And as a consequence of that, it's predicting what you're going to see and hear and feel and taste and so on. So the whole thing's happening predictively. The whole thing's happening outside of your awareness. Takes much shorter time than it took me to even explain it. And it's happening all the time.
It's fascinating. I think it's a great description of, a lot of your work, of course. And those predictions are for pleasant experiences, as well as unpleasant experiences, as well as what we might identify as relatively neutral experiences.
Yeah. So in fact, humans care a lot about valence, pleasantness, unpleasantness. We care a lot about that, but it's not, and that's a feature. Those are features of experience that we get out of our brains. It's not really clear that those are the features that the brain computes on, though. So, as a biological system, your brain cares a lot about energy regulation. It cares a lot about glucose. And it cares a lot about, but it's not really clear that it cares a lot about comfort per se, right? There's these really interesting experiments that were done with mice who were bred to, for example, to not have the genes to taste anything. So these animals really, they wouldn't ever experience pleasure in tasting or aversion in tasting. They just would nothing experiential. But they were able to learn to eat high calorie foods just as well as the animals who could taste things. And when you look biologically at the signal that's driving their eating behavior, it's how well the cells in their stomach are metabolizing the glucose. It's not even the amount of glucose in their bloodstream. It's really about how efficiently are the cells metabolizing glucose? How efficiently are they turning it into products like ATP in order to fuel themselves? Valence and arousal, pleasantness, unpleasantness, those are features that are subjectively important to us, and they're features that our brains produce. But it's not really clear that they're features that our brains compute on. And I know that sounds crazy because every psychology textbook and paper talks about how the brain makes valuation judgments and so on. And I guess I'm just less convinced that it's still a question of how does the brain produce these features. It's just not clear that the features it produces are also the features it's computing on.
That's so interesting from a biochemical perspective.
Yeah,
because some of that really starts to talk to interoception, which you've done some work around. And I know you kind of have a metaphor for that, which is the body budget or body budgeting.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could, I guess you just describe what body budgeting is. And
well, I could do it in a little more depth because I think it's really important. And the first thing I'll say is that in the scientific literature, interoception is defined as your awareness of sensory signals from your body. That's incorrect. Your brain is running a model of your body in the world. The way to think about it is that your brain spends its entire life in a dark, silent box called your skull. And it's receiving outcomes, sensory changes from your body and from the world. But it has no access to the causes. It only has access to the outcomes. This is what philosophers call a reverse inference problem. So your brain has to guess at what the causes are. And that's true in your body, and it's also true in the world. So, if you hear a loud bang, is that, a car backfiring? Is that a door slamming? Is it a gunshot? What is it? Because whatever your brain guesses it will be is going to dictate what you do next, right? Similarly, if you have a tug in your chest, is that indigestion? Is that anxiety? Is that the beginnings of a heart attack? That particular quandary has killed more women, actually, over the age of 65 in Western countries than you might be surprised to know, because they're, how people make sense of their sensations, and more specifically, how their doctors make sense of their sensations, is really gendered, and it's really problematic. But the thing to realize is that, your brain is making sense of these sensations, and the sensations from your body come from this ongoing regulation, which I describe as body budgeting. And the technical term is allostasis, which means the brain's attempt to anticipate the needs of the body and meet those needs before they arise. So think about it as, you want to have glucose there before you need it. You want to have, as your brain is standing you up, you want your brain as your brain is standing you up, it's going to raise your blood pressure as it stands you up, so that oxygen can get to your brain and you won't faint, because fainting is really metabolically costly. And so
that's really interesting right there, because you're saying allostasis is a state of the brain versus most people would identify allostasis as kind of a snapshot of the body's physiology in time.
I would say allostasis actually is any physiological process that is predictively regulating for the purposes of efficiency and balance, like energy balance. So I think it is something that the brain does with respect to the body. And it is also something that organ systems in the body do with respect to each other. I don't think the brain certainly doesn't have all the control over bodily systems. That's just not the case. And but what I would say is that the partly the reason evolutionarily why we may have a brain. I mean, we have a brain, but it may be that the reason why we have a brain is that we have a lot of really complex systems. Now, there are a lot of animals that have less complexity inside their own bodies. They're usually smaller. So, waste can get to the periphery of the body by osmosis, and they don't require these fancy schmancy organ systems that we have. And those animals tend not to have brains. They don't need them. Brains are like really expensive organs. That 3-pound blob between your ears costs you about 20% of your entire metabolic budget. That's the most expensive organ that you have. And when you have all of these systems and they all have to be coordinated and they're all using the same resources, you need to have kind of an organizer. And that's one way to think about what the brain is doing. And I describe this as body budgeting, which is it's a metaphor. And so all metaphors, have their strengths and weaknesses. But I think it's a decent metaphor. Your brain isn't budgeting money. It's budgeting glucose and salt and water and oxygen and all the nutrients that your brain needs to keep you alive and well. And you can think about some of the things that you do as deposits, like eating healthfully, sleeping. You can think of some of the things that you do as withdrawals, like anytime you basically move your body or learn something new. Those are two pretty expensive withdrawals. Or exercise, for example. So exercise is a withdrawal, but it's a great investment, right? Because you're expecting a return on that investment. So you're spending in the moment, but you're expecting that you're going to get a return on your investment in terms of, a healthy brain and a healthy memory and, attention and mind and so on. And in fact, actually regular exercise does lead to more successful aging and less memory loss as quickly and so on and so forth. So, and then you can start to think about, the ways in which other people can metaphorically make deposits and withdrawals into your body budget, or the way that you can contribute to theirs. And you can start thinking about stress, which is just, stress is just your brain preparing your body to make a metabolic outlay. That's it. But you can start to think about stress in terms of cost. And you can start to think about things like depression or failure to learn something new, like your brain is making predictions, but it's not updating based on new information, as might happen in chronic pain. You can start to think about those as being related to deficit spending,
That's really interesting. I mean, it's interesting to me from the perspective, I understand obviously what you mean by the sense of emotion is a perception. Everything in some way your brain is doing is a perception. It can be a little difficult for people, I think, with pain to hear that, because it's almost like they're responsible, or their body's responsible for, is it correct to say an error in prediction, so to speak?
Yeah, I think so. Well, it depends on the kind of pain, right? So if we're using the international, right. So I would say, I mean, some people maybe feel that way, but the more the reaction that I get from people is like relief. And because, you are your brain is you, but there are aspects of the way that your brain works that you have no control over in the moment, really. You do have more control over what your brain does. There's a very Cartesian language here, which is, you are your brain is you. It's not like, your brain is controlling you. Your brain is you. Right. There's no, but when you start to realize what's actually happening under the hood, it's hard to change it in the moment, but what you can start to do is expand the period of control, like that you have. You can start to do things in advance or after the fact that can improve your well-being, even if it doesn't remove your discomfort, which I know sounds like a crazy thing to say, but there's ample research to show this. And I will also say, as someone who has been a longtime migraine sufferer, and have had experience in my family with chronic pain, and my sister-in-law suffers from fibromyalgia, and we have members of our family who are depressed and so on. it actually really, really helps. And it's helped actually in remarkable ways. For me, that's not, I mean, although I'm really happy about that it's helpful, the evidence, the scientific evidence is what convinces me, really. And that's the following. Your brain is always sending predictions to your body to control your body, and your body is always sending sense data back to your brain, including nociceptive input. And whatever your brain doesn't predict, so your brain is really changing. A prediction really is your brain changing the firing of its own neurons in advance of receiving sense data. When it receives sense data from the body or from the world, if it's predicted that data, then the firing doesn't change. And in fact, all the sense data did was confirm the prediction. So nothing about the information from your body actually created that experience in that moment. It's really all in your brain. Even when there is tissue damage, right? So when there really is tissue damage in your body or impending tissue damage, your brain is starting to construct, to predict the experience of pain. And then the nociceptive input comes and confirms that prediction. That pain was still constructed in your brain, right? It was just confirmed by your body. As your body heals, hopefully your brain learns that information that it didn't predict to update its ability to predict in the future. But learning is metabolically expensive. It's one of the most expensive things your brain can do. Move your body and learn something new. And so if for whatever reason you are metabolically encumbered, your brain will learn less well. And one way to think about chronic pain is that it's real. I mean, no one is saying, I mean, everything you experience is in your brain. What you see is in your brain. It's not in your eyes. What you hear is in your brain. It's not in your ears. If you pinch yourself, that pinch that you feel is not on your skin. You're feeling it in your brain. Everything you feel is in your brain. Your brain is constructing everything you feel. But when things go on in your body or in the world that are not predicted, your brain has an opportunity to learn that new information and update its predictions. And if it doesn't, for all kinds of reasons this can happen, you will continue to experience pain. And so, there are chronic pain you can think about as a problem, as a brain disease. It's a biological illness, just the way that depression is a biological illness. And in fact, they both have a basis in metabolic issues. Not only that, but certainly partially that. So I think that once people understand that, actually, they don't feel, most people released from, they feel relieved by that. And they have a kind of a release of,
because it may take away the impending threat value from their body, saying, okay, it's not something wrong with my body per se, even though my brain is my body, but there's something else happening here other than what I thought it was, or other than what I perceived was happening. It's interesting to me that you say the highest metabolic kind of activity is moving your body and learning. And in most chronic pain programs, that's what the focus really is. The focus is on moving your body and then actually teaching people about pain or other cognitive behavioral interventions.
Yeah.
Well, really what do you have a lot of learning, actually.
Yeah. And right. Exactly. And in fact, I'll just say that I had a real epiphany when I was learning about some chronic pain treatments, which are a little bit like exposure therapy, but in really small doses. So you're having people move into the pain in really small doses. But what that's doing is it's giving the brain a teaching signal. That's what sometimes we talk about prediction error, like stuff your brain didn't predict, either sense data that's there that your brain failed to predict, or sense data that isn't there that your brain did predict. Those errors are are teaching signals. They're opportunities to learn. And if you titrate it just right, where it's not too big and not too small, you for a person at their given state, you basically, what you're doing is you're teaching the brain to recalibrate itself. And that makes a ton of sense. So constantly, I've worked out with a coach he doesn't like me to call him my trainer, so he's my coach. So I've worked out with buddies, for like 15 years. And I'm getting up there in years, I should just say. And so, I like to lift heavy weights, and I like to do things. Well, like is a relative word, but you know what I mean. And so he'll say, we had to come up with this language of like, is there a sensation? Are you aware of a feeling in a muscle or a part of your body? Is it is it just an awareness? Is it more of a sensation? Is it discomfort, or is it actually, like distressfully painful, right? And that language has been really, really useful, especially when you're recovering from an injury. Like sometimes I get exuberant, and I've injured my rotator cuff, and I've injured my back, and I've injured, all kinds of, and but you have to lean into and by the way, I have a fantastic physical therapist who is, his name is Barry Meckler. He's amazing. And my coach is Michael Alves, but these guys kept me together basically while I was writing these books, because I was sitting for How Emotions Are Made took me 3.5 years to write. Wow. 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, not exaggerating. These guys kept my brain, let's just say, doing its body budgeting job.
So as a fellow author, I completely appreciate that. And I understand when I read your book, How Emotions Are Made, it's like reading, of course, all of your literature in PubMed, but folded into a way that has story and theory and application to the modern world and application to chronic disease. And I when I read it, I was like, this book is, it's massive and it's wonderful. I encourage everyone to access it, and we'll link to it in the show notes. Just along those lines, so like yourself, I've actually had pain when I've written some books. I think part of that's just from sitting, because I think sitting is an awful thing for the body.
It's a horrible thing for the body.
Yeah, it really is. And I think both you and I as professionals can agree to that. And then of course there's as you mentioned, the learning aspect. I think writing a book has learning involved in it on some level, because you're taking what you know and you're trying to repackage it and repurpose it for the reader. So it's a little bit different. How does body budgeting, so we're talking about, we can influence our thoughts, we can influence the physical body. How does body budgeting play into us regulating our emotions? Because it seems like body budgeting sounds like it's very physical, and most people think of emotions as a psychological experience.
Well, everything that is psychological is also physical. So I don't mean that in a mystical, airy, fairy way. I mean that actually really, quite literally. But here's the way that I would describe it. So your brain's always controlling your body. Your body's always sending sense data back to your brain. For the most part, we're not aware of those sense data. You're not aware of your heart beating most of the time. You're not aware of your lungs expanding. You're not aware of, your liver making bile. You have all kinds of changes in temperature that you're very rarely aware of. Your GI tract right now. I mean, right now, Joe, we're both sitting here talking to each other, and inside each of us, there is a drama going on of great proportion, right? Like every listener who's listening, hopefully, fully enraptured by what we're saying. Each person, there's this whole like drama unfolding that mostly we're unaware of, thank God. And because, it's only when something goes wrong usually that we become aware. So, and if you doubt that at all, think about the last time you had some GI distress, or a fever of any magnitude. The outside world fades away and you're completely kind of focused on your body. And this is what philosophers call tragic embodiment. we're largely not wired to experience those sensations in any real precise way, the way that we experience the world. Our visual sense has a lot of precision to it, and so on and so forth.
And so, that's efficient, right? That's because of efficiency. It would be kind of inefficient if I felt every organ moving and pulsing throughout the entire day, right?
If you felt every organ, if you felt any organ, you would be, even when you feel your heartbeat, you're not really feeling your heartbeat. What you're feeling is your heart slamming against your chest. And that's what you're feeling. You're feeling the vibration. It's really more of a touch feeling than it is an actual feeling of, if you actually feel your heart, as anyone can tell you who's had a heart attack, you don't want to feel your heart beating. It's incredibly painful when you're in the beginnings of a heart attack and you can feel actually what's going on. Or think about, appendicitis. What you have is a kind of like dull ache over your whole abdomen for most of the time until your appendix is about to burst. And it's only at that moment that you feel a very specific pain, usually over your appendix, but not always. So it's kind of vague, and we are wired that way, actually. If you look at the wiring, that the neurons that bring the signals from the body up to the brain, they're not really built for this high precision sensation. So instead, what evolution has given us is kind of a workaround, which is the brain, as it's receiving these sense data, is really compressing them and summarizing them. And what we get is more of a general feeling of feeling pleasant or feeling unpleasant, feeling comfortable, feeling uncomfortable, feeling worked up, feeling quiescent and calm. And those feelings, which most people call mood, and scientists refer to as affect with an A, those feelings are with you every waking moment of your life. Sometimes they're in the foreground, sometimes they're in the background, but they're always with you because your brain's always budgeting and your body is always sending sense data back to your brain. So these are features of consciousness which are always with you. Sometimes, when your brain makes meaning of the sense data as an emotional event, you will experience these as emotions, but you don't always. So affect these are general, kind of simpler feelings. Like, for example, when you feel unpleasant, and again, there's an evolutionary, kind of a really cool evolutionary story here too, about why it works this way, which we could talk about. But when you feel unpleasant, usually you don't know why. If it's just a feeling of unpleasantness, like you're distressed and you're feeling uncomfortable, your brain has to guess. How much information is there in, I feel bad. I mean, what do you do about it? What's causing it? I mean, there's no information. Your brain has to link this to other information in order to make sense of it. So really what an emotion is your brain is making sense of your physical state in relation to what's going on around you in the world, using events from your past, which you learned were emotions. And so your brain is basically using that information to make sense of the present and predict the immediate future. So you can think about emotions really as predictions. They're predictions for making sense of what is causing the sense changes in your body in relation to what's going on around you in the world. And it's not just emotions that are constructed this way. All experiences are constructed this way. Even pain, the experience of pain is constructed this way. So there's really lovely research, which I'm sure you know about, showing that, people who have chronic back pain or chronic pain who are dependent on opioids, which, by the way, work because they work on the affective piece of pain, which is why, one reason why when people become addicted to them, they're becoming addicted because they're regulating really disruption in their body budget, right?
Yeah.
That you could teach people to actually, with mindfulness meditation, to separate out, to sort of deconstruct their distress into just discomfort. Mm-hmm. Now, discomfort is still uncomfortable, but discomfort is more like what you feel when you have the flu. When you have the flu, even though the symptoms that you experience are almost identical to being very, very, very depressed, maybe with the exception of a fever. But even then, you don't think of yourself as a bad person. You don't think of yourself as really being, even though your nervous system actually is playing a causal role in making you sick when you have the flu. You don't feel like you're responsible, and you don't berate yourself. You just feel like shit, basically. Yeah. And there is a value in not mentalizing everything, like not experiencing everything as a psychological state. But to answer your question, you can better regulate your emotions by keeping your body budget solvent. If it's easier for your brain to regulate your body and you're not running a deficit, you're going to have less opportunity to feel like shit, and there'll be less opportunity for negative emotion. That's the bottom line. So I'm not saying it's a cure-all, for everything, but when it comes to your emotions and your well-being in general, as you know, and your body for sure, you have to stop thinking about simple single causes of things, and you have to start thinking more like there are a lot of little nudges that you can nudge the system in one direction or another. Lots of little tiny causes which all influence each other, and so your job is to sort of architect your life in a way that presents the maximum opportunity, for well-being.
I think what you just said is so critical, because your model in theory lends itself well to really an integrative model of care.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about chronic pain or any other condition, acute or chronic. And even as you mentioned, like just a simple cold involves many other aspects than just the physiologic event that's happening.
Yeah, this is the thing that I have to say, when COVID hit, this drove me slightly mad, actually, because there's research, this really, really good research by a psychologist named Sheldon Cohen at Carnegie Mellon. He did what are called viral challenge studies. And so what he did was he sequestered people away in hotel rooms, and he controlled everything, how much they slept, what they ate, temperature and so on. And then he would place a virus in their nose, and he controlled the dose. So viral load was the same for every single person. And actually one of these was a COVID virus, not COVID-19, but a different one. Oh, sorry, not a COVID virus, a coronavirus. And depending on the study, only 20 to 40% of people developed symptoms. So right there, that should tell you that exposure to a virus is not the same thing as infection. Only some people became infected, right? They were exposed to the virus and they carried the virus, but they didn't have symptoms. They didn't become sick. And it also tells you that a virus is a necessary cause of respiratory illness, but it is not a sufficient cause, which means there have to be other necessary causes that all work together. This is a really hard point that people have a hard time with this, and so the state of the immune system of the host, meaning you, the state of your body, which is controlled by your brain, is also a necessary but not sufficient condition for getting sick. But it's necessary because not everybody got sick. So that means the state of your body budget can make it easier or harder for you to fight off a pathogen. And this is always true. In fact, I just the other day was reading about cholera. And it turns out that many people carry the bacteria in their gut that would cause cholera. even now. But most people don't get sick from it because the way that their gut is physiologically constructed, it doesn't allow the bacteria to get what they need to reproduce, and so they can't. And so occasionally, if you're infected, occasionally if you're exposed to a pathogen, you won't. If your body budget's in good shape, you're not gonna, and therefore your immune system will be in good shape because they're very linked. Then you're not going to be as likely to get sick. And it turns out that now that we're in the time of vaccines, you should also know that the efficacy of a vaccine to a new pathogen is very much determined by the state of your immune system. And so things like chronic stress, which means lots of withdrawals that you didn't replenish, that you didn't make deposits to cover, or lots of times that your brain prepared you for a big metabolic outlay that never came. Things like childhood adversity, which means that, something very bad happened to you when you were a child, and maybe it was just neglect, maybe it was outward abuse, but, there are a number of things that can happen to children, and the more of those you have, the more they leave their mark on your body. Well, actually, I'll just actually make the point that your body doesn't keep score. Your brain keeps score, and your body is the scorecard.
Thank you for saying that, because I have heard people say this over and over. Things like emotions are stored in your muscles, emotions are stored in your body, and it drives me up a wall.
Yeah, there's just that's a nice metaphor. Like when I say to my daughter, you carry a little piece of my heart around with you everywhere you go. That's a nice metaphor, but she doesn't actually literally carry. That's what I was saying to you before about metaphors, right? Metaphors are great. As you know, as a writer, you have to use them in order to communicate complicated things to people. And we use them with each other too, right? But they often give the illusion of knowledge when in fact, they aren't knowledge. They're just giving you a gist level explanation. And sometimes that gist level explanation can suggest the wrong thing. So I think it's really great that people understand that when your body budget is not efficient, for whatever reason, there are all kinds of reasons, some of which could have nothing to do with your behavior, like your mitochondria just aren't up to snuff, or there's just so many things, or you go through menopause, for example, or you're getting older as a guy. As we get older, we lose sex hormones. Women do it, over a couple of years. Men do it very slowly throughout their whole lives. Sex hormones are metabolic regulators. Mm-hmm. Dopamine is a metabolic regulator. Serotonin is a metabolic. They're all metabolic regulators. That's how they evolved. So I'm not reducing everything to metabolism. I'm just saying that whenever something adverse happens to you, you pay a little tax. Mm-hmm. And those little taxes, if you don't take care of them, will add up over time. The way to think about it is when water is dripping on a pipe, like a solid steel pipe, it doesn't bore a hole in the pipe the first time or the second time or even the thousandth time, but eventually it will bore a hole in that pipe. And your body sort of works in the same way. So you are not storing emotions in your muscles, but you do receive sense data from your body that your brain either is predicting or is not predicting, so it can learn. And it has to make sense of those. And it will make sense of those as emotions if that's what you've learned to do. Yeah. But it doesn't always have to if you learn to make sense of your emotions, your sense data in another way. So your body doesn't keep score of anything. Your brain keeps score, and your body is the scorecard.
Yeah, I appreciate that deeply, because that has been said on this podcast in a certain different context. And the whole point of this as a public service announcement really is one of education. So you start to learn about how the body works. Obviously, your brain and mind are part of your body and the influence there. Now, a lot of your model has an impact on social cultural
Yeah.
aspects that, and I think as you're talking about coronavirus and immunizations, we're rolling these out right now.
Yeah.
Or they started to roll out last year during a time of incredible economic turmoil, social unrest, political problems. How does your model help us to, let's say, construct a better society? And even with regard to chronic pain, since still the prevailing thought is that chronic pain is a problem with your body, which it isn't. It's a problem with your nervous system. So how do we use these kind of theories where we can have, in essence, one body budget affect another body budget in a way that is healing for all of us?
I'm really glad you asked me that, Joe, because I think this is, and so now, and now as we're going to talk about this, I'm going to ease my lab coat off. Okay. So I'm still going to be talking to you from what I know based on science, but, some of this is speculation and this is my speculation, but it's speculation based on, I would say, what I understand scientifically and also what I see around me. And that's the following, the best thing, well, this is definitely true from a science, well, to the extent that anything is true in science, we don't, and scientists don't like the F word very much, fact. It's like a really scary word for us, right? So this is what the evidence shows, right? Is that the best thing for a human nervous system is another human. And the worst thing for a human nervous system is another human. And, we evolved as social animals. We are the caretakers of each other's body budgets. It doesn't matter what your political opinion is. It doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what you think. It's just the way things are. And we live in a culture that has a profound disconnect in the sense that we really value individual rights and freedoms, but we have socially dependent nervous systems. And it's not just the things that we do that affect each other. It's also the things that we say that affect each other. The parts of the system in your brain, which allows you to understand language and speak, also regulates your body. It's not by accident that it's this way. In fact, in songbirds, for example, who have a system that's thought to be somewhat homologous to the human language system, it works exactly the same way. The system that influences a bird's ability to learn song and to sing and to understand song actually controls the bird's body. And that means that I can text 3 little words to a really close friend of mine halfway across the world, and she doesn't have to hear my voice. She doesn't have to see my face. She will just read those words, and I can change her breathing. I can change her heart rate. And you can read something that was written, a poem or a religious text from thousands of years ago, and you can find solace in that, and it can also infuriate you, meaning, it will change your metabolism. It will change your heart rate. It will change your breathing rate. That's the power of words. So we influence each other in all kinds of ways. Like other animals who are social, we can influence each other's body budgets through touch, through smell, through sight, through sound. But we also have this extra way that we have with words, right? I can say a word to you, like I can say, Joe, I had pizza for dinner last night. That one word, I have 40 features in my head that my brain is conjuring, to tell you about what my meal was like. But I say one word, and then you conjure some number of those features in your brain, right? And if there's enough overlap, we've just communicated. That's what it means to communicate. So words are these really, and if it's, so not everything is going to be perfect. I'm from the East Coast. So I'm thinking, thin crust. And if you were from Chicago, you would be thinking thick crust. And we could debate about the importance of the value of, thin versus thick crust. But the point is that even as you think about the pizza, if we were measuring your stomach motility or your salivary output, and it was around lunchtime, you might start salivating at the thought of pizza. Actually, pizza's so good, you might start salivating at any time if I just mentioned the word pizza. So your brain that's your brain basically in its predictive mode, which it's always doing. And so what this means is that we don't just have more control over our own experiences, making sense of these sense data in ways that are beneficial for us, but we also have more responsibility for other people's well-being, more than we might, in this culture anyways, more than we might like. And it's so hard for people to even consider that this is true. Even if I just raise the issue, some people become very irate, even at the suggestion. So to answer your question, we just lived through we're in a political era that is probably a massive public health risk for people. And all the uncertainty when a brain can't predict, not being able to predict and having to learn is very metabolically expensive. Uncertainty and things being random or unpredictable, really hard on a human nervous system. So we have all of that, plus we have, COVID, and we're socially distanced from one another. And many people are struggling with social isolation, which means they're managing their body budgets on their own, which we did not evolve to do. And there is an extra sort of tax to that. So it's a really challenging time. And that's why I think it's particularly important. I certainly didn't write 7.5 lessons knowing that there would be a pandemic, frankly. But some of the lessons there, I think, there's some lessons in there about how to treat each other, about how to be a little more compassionate with yourself, perhaps, about all the kinds of things that can be influencing your body budget and therefore influencing your experience of yourself in the world, your way of being in the world. It gives you a different perspective, and it gives you some choices that maybe you didn't know that you had.
Yeah, it's one of the first books that is written in a way that's simple and approachable. And in the beginning, it starts out like many books on the brain and the mind do, where it sounds a little scientific and clinical, but I think by the end of the book, you take it out of the science and the clinic and you put it into real life for people. And I think that's the beauty of that book, particularly because it's like, okay, I have this brain, I have this mind, I have this body. I have some influence and control over it. And at the same time, on a pro-social level, whatever I'm doing is going to influence my family, my town, my society. And I think if we take concepts like that of neuroscience in a way that aren't so scientific, so to speak, it helps people connect to, okay, now I feel like I know what this thing is in my body and how to use it, so to speak. And it's very similar to pain. Like we educate people about pain. They have a reconceptualization of what pain is, and then they can make different decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Make different decisions. Yeah. I think it's really important to understand, as I'm sure you teach people, right, that discomfort is there for a reason. You would never want to get rid of it. It's useful.
Yeah.
And, similarly, I would say, look, the goal here isn't to always make everybody happy. Like that's actually not the goal, right? The goal is for everyone to feel that they can be the best self and live their best life. But what I would say is, and again, now I'm not being a neuroscientist as much as just taking what I know about neuroscience and applying it in the way that you asked me to. We live in a culture of casual brutality. Mm-hmm. People speak to each other in ways that strip them of their human dignity, that are completely unnecessary. Because, Joe, you and I can disagree on a lot of things, even really important things, but we can still agree that we're both human and we both deserve a certain basic amount of basic human dignity. And and there are just these little things every day that happen. Like, I was, when my daughter was in high school, she would tell me about some of the conversations that occur between kids. And I'm thinking, when someone walks up to you and says, "Hey, bitch, you're such a fucking idiot," that can mean, "Hi, honey, it's good to see," like, "Oh, hi, best friend, it's great to see you." It can mean, "I'm going to punch the shit out of you right now." I mean, it can mean, or anything in between. How do you know? It's all driven by context. And so I think, we don't always have to be nice to each other. We absolutely can be critical of each other. We don't have to agree on everything. We can debate. It's important that everyone have the opportunity to have their say. But we can do it in a way that's respectful and in a way that doesn't strip people of their basic human dignity. And maybe you think I'm going too far with this, but I just think that we have constructed for ourselves, if I had to, based on what I know about the nervous system, if I had to engineer an environment that would drive a human body budget into bankruptcy, it would be the one that we are currently living in.
Which is profound. And those implications on chronic pain are also profound, I think. Because you're looking, really, when you look at chronic pain, as we mentioned before, all of our conditions have a mind-body component to them. But chronic pain really sticks out as probably the one that most people can identify the easiest. And I think a lot of ways you're saying we've created a societal context that is stripping everyone's body budget down day by day by day. And with that, that's why we have chronic disease, whether it's physical, mental, and I can't even separate the physical from the mental anymore.
Exactly. And I think, again, I would say, remember, we're not talking about simple single causes. Nothing works that way. It's all about, lots of little ingredients which all interact with each other. So, it's not like chronic stress is going to cause you to develop, respiratory illness, but it's a necessary precondition. It's one of the necessary preconditions. So anything which is going to deplete your immune system and, which is related to having an encumbered body budget, a body budget running a deficit. Anything which drives your body budget into that state is going to make you more likely to be sick. And when you encounter a pathogen, that's just always going to be true. I think the way that I would say it is basically that people are suffering. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of suffering. Some of that suffering people experience is mental. Some of the suffering people experience is physical. But there's a lot of suffering. Some of it we can't escape, but a lot of it is self-inflicted. And by self-inflicted, I don't necessarily mean you yourself are doing it to yourself. I mean that we're participating in a culture that that makes it really hard right now. Yeah. But there are also really small things that we can do. Like, not everybody has control over everything, but everybody has control over something. Like I was just telling my husband this morning, I wrote this piece in The Guardian last week about human connectedness in the time of COVID, that there are these lurking in our socially distanced lives right now. There are these little opportunities that people are availing themselves of to maintain connection, actually through words and other means. And then I was thinking this morning, and people, there's like I didn't actually think that this piece was going to be all that special, but there was just an outpouring of gratitude from emails and texts and LinkedIn posts and whatever about this piece. And I was thinking, we always write about people who do momentous things. But one of my neighbors is he's a quiet guy who lives a fairly, small life. What I mean by that is he has his neighbors, he has his family, but he's not like on the national stage. He's not like a politician, he's not doing anything. But I think this guy probably touches more people in a positive way on a day-to-day basis than just because he's kind. And that's not just an investment it's not just a deposit in somebody else's body budget. When you are kind, it's also helpful for you. Yeah. I've
been speaking with Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she has 2 wonderful books that I have personally read. They're earmarked, lots of pages with great notes. I recommend you read them. There's 7.5 lessons about the brain and how emotions are made. Lisa, thank you for your time today, and please let everyone know how they can learn more about you and follow you.
Sure. I have a website, lisafeldmanbarrett.com, all one word. I'm also on Twitter, and I'm not really using Facebook so much anymore, but you can send me an email. You can find on my website, there's access to both of these books, but also all of the popular science writing that I've done for the New York Times, The Guardian, other newspapers and magazines, some videos that I've made. My TED Talks are there, and this podcast will be there when it's ready and up. So
great. So we'll of course link to both of her books in the show notes and her website, lisafeldmanbarrett.com. You can find all those links on the website at the Integrative Pain Science Institute. Make sure to share this episode with your friends and family who are interested in the brain, neuroscience, and how emotions are made. I'm Joe Tatta. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.